Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining the third webinar session of the African Ombudsman Research Centre, AORC, in 2022. It is always a pleasure to engage with our regular delegates. To those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Brian MacArthur, Acting Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Law and Management Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. My role this morning is to deliver a welcome address on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and the Council of the University of the KwaZulu-Natal, the home of the African Ombudsman Research Centre. Let me start by acknowledging the Chairperson of the African Ombudsman Research Centre, Board, and President of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, AOMA, and Public Protector of South Africa, Advocate Busisiwe Mkhubane. The Dean and Head of the UKZN School of Law and member of the AORC Board, Professor Managay Reddy. Deputy Public Protector of South Africa, Advocate Gulega Taleka. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panel comprising Ombudsman of the Seychelles, Honourable Nicole Tirant-Tiradi, who will also facilitate the proceedings today. Director and Managing Consultant of Governance and Management Services International, Professor Victor Ayani. It is also my pleasure to welcome former colleague, Advocate Arlene Brock, visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, former Director of AORC, and former Ombudsman of Bermuda. Greetings also to Excellencies and Honourable Ombudsman, distinguished participants and guests, all colleagues, students, our alumni, and members of the media. I welcome you to our webinar session under the theme, Seeking Higher Ground, Ethics and Values of the Ombudsman. We covered this topic last year, but due to requests from members of AOMA, we felt that it was important to review the topic again. More importantly, because the Ombudsman's goal is to continuously advocate for better values and ethics in the public administration and within the Ombudsman institution itself. Therefore, it is important from time to time to reflect and engage in introspection, since, as the Ombudsman institution in the African continent, we aim to keep our integrity beyond reproach in order to maintain public confidence. As members of AOMA, we operate in diverse legislative, economic, and social settings. Forums such as this one enable us to discuss critical operational issues and share best practices with our counterparts. Based on the questions that we have received on this topic thus far, I look forward to hearing our esteemed panel sharing their perspectives on whether or not there is a need for a general code of ethics for ombudsmen, considering our backgrounds, and the strategies that we can implement in the promotion of ethics and accountability in government and the ombudsman institutions. In closing, I would like to remind members of AOMA regarding the management of the COVID-19 pandemic that the South African Cabinet has decided to ease several restrictions as part of the adjusted alert level 1. This means that it may soon be possible for us to meet in person for some of the meetings if South Africa is identified as the host country. I would like to take this opportunity to thank AOMA members for the continued support of the virtual AORC webinar series. But please, let us continue to adhere to the COVID regulations in our various jurisdictions in order to restore some normality in the near future. I once again welcome you to the third webinar session of the AORC in 2022. It is now my great pleasure to hand over to Advocate Mkhubane, who will formally welcome you as the chairperson of AORC. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor MacArthur. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists for agreeing to address us today, Advocate Brock and Professor Ayani, thank you so much for availing yourselves. For the benefit of those who are present here, I would also like to thank Professor Reddy, who's been with us, and I understand her contract will be expiring not long as the Dean of School of Law. And we thank her so much for the contributions she has made. She has enriched our deliberations. She has also assisted us as AORC, the African Ombudsman Research Center. And I think she's part of family where we would also go back to her to assist us in the future. So for the benefit of everyone, as the president of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, I'll also thank the ombudsmen who are present here. Thank you so much for taking time. This is very much important for us so that we can know and we can also improve as these institutions. And since we are the institutions which must lead by example, and whether when we lead by example, whether do we need to have the code which will also guide our operations. As you know as well that we rely so much on the OR Tambo principles, which always, or the minimums, the OR Tambo minimum standards for effective ombudsman institutions and cooperation. So the standards cover the independence and autonomy of such institutions, the establishment of such institutions that is preferably guaranteed in the constitutions of the individual states, and the security of tenure for the heads of such institutions. They also touch on the mandates, resources, operations, accessibility, conditions of service, impartiality, and accountability of such institutions. It's very much key, the issue of accountability, because also then the question is who guards the guardians, and since we are holding state institutions to account, but then we also should be held to account as an ombudsman. So we know that as well in terms of the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, Article 15, it's very clear that it deals with the establishment of support and effectiveness of ombudsman institutions and other institutions supporting democracy. So one of the challenges in Africa is the reality that the autonomies, the anatomies of such institutions across the continent still varies from country to country, and there should be standards which are set to make sure that there's that issue of collaboration and the standard operations of various structures. So we are always committed to make sure that we assist in the continental Agenda 2063 in making sure that we create the Africa which we want into reality. And also we need to make sure that we assist in the implementation or in the achievement of the aspirations, especially the third and the fourth aspirations of the Agenda 2063, which deals with good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice and the rule of law, and peace and security, respectively. This includes continental efforts to silence the guns by 2020. Coming back to the appointment of various ombudsmen, and also the issue that the ombudsman are also accountable. For instance, in South Africa, when the ombudsman's decision or the remedial action of the public protector, which the Constitutional Court said is binding unless set aside by a court of law, therefore the public protector's decisions is also standing a test of time, or then is reviewed by a court or set aside. And as well, the public protector is accountable to the parliament. So it will be interesting to hear then, if we have the code of conduct, how can we promote that, and how can we make sure that there is that particular compliance? Indeed, there should be accountability, for each and every structure, and especially for the institutions like ours who are holding those who are in state affairs to account. Therefore, we will also have to account for our conduct, and it will be very helpful because some institutions or some countries, the ombudsman take an oath of office. In other countries, that is not happening. And in other countries, they also sign the performance agreement with the relevant structure where they report to, possibly the National Assembly as well. But then in other countries, that is not happening. So it will be very much helpful in these deliberations. What can we have as AOMA, which we can promote and encourage all state institute, all ombudsmen to consider. Thank you so much to the organizers, the AORC team. You always doing the great job. And let's hand over then to the facilitator to take us through the program. Thank you, Honorable Ombudsman Tarrant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd like to welcome everybody. I see Professor Ayani has joined us. Good morning, sir. It's from my end. It's early afternoon in Seychelles. Good morning to everyone. This morning we will be talking about seeking higher ground and the values and ethics of the Office of the Ombudsman. And we have two very, very highly, what is the word? Highly distinguished guests to speak. They will be Professor Ayani and Advocate Arlene Brock, who knows our region very well, having been with us in our African region until I believe it was 2020. So I would like to introduce first of all our first speaker, Professor Ayani. Professor Victor Ayani is the Director and Managing Consultant of Governance and Management Services International, a UK-based training and consultancy firm specialized in the governance and maintenance and management issues of developing countries and transitional democracies. Prior to this, he was Director of Governance and Institutional Development at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, and before that, Deputy Director and Lead Advisor in Governance and Public Sector Management. Previously, he taught at the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, the University of Botswana, and the University of the North in South Africa. Professor Ayani is an accomplished scholar and practitioner. He has carried out teachings, research, and advisory assignments in over 45 countries in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, North America, and the Pacific. He has a wide and versatile publication record in public sector governance and management, international development, and African and Commonwealth studies. His extensive research and professional work sets him out as one of Africa's leading minds on the institutional responses to securing effective oversight of governments, resolving citizens' grievances, and ensuring responsive and performance-driven public services. Professor Ayani is internationally acclaimed for his work on the Ombudsman and related oversight institutions. In addition to his pioneering work, which positioned the Commonwealth Secretariat as a leading technical player in this field, he has been directly involved in the establishment and institutional development of over 100 ombudsman organizations around the world. Indeed, Dr. Ayani has consistently focused on ensuring that his research and institutional development assignments are not just underpinned by hard evidence and rigorous analyses, but also contribute meaningfully to providing practical solutions and concrete action steps for the future. Professor Ayani holds a PhD in public administration. He is a British and Nigerian national, married with 4 adult children. Professor Ayani, please make your presentation. You will be talking on the focus of whether there is a need for a general code of ethics for ombudsmen. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning, everybody. Madam Chairman, the President of AOMA, my colleagues at the university, Professor MacArthur, the chair of the occasion, Ombudsman Terrent of Seychelles, Advocate Arlene Brock, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked to speak on a subject that I think the chair already made some remarks about. But let me quickly put up my slide, because I have a slide that I want to share. And I hope it will. Can you see the slide, please? Is everybody able to see my slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, all right, okay. So I decided to title my presentation, Strengthening the Ombudsman and Ethics Value System, Any Need for a Code. And I thought that it would be useful to do that because it's quite easy to get this whole discussion, to misunderstand the discussion. And I thought the central question I'll be asking, is there a need for a code of ethics or conduct for the ombudsman? But it's also possible that as we discuss this, we can get very academic. Respect to all my colleagues who are in academics. We can get very, it can become very pedantic, and we don't want that discussion to be that way, because it needs to address practical and realistic things. So I thought I would spend some quick time trying to throw some light on why we actually need a discussion like this. The president of AOMA, Ombudsman, Public Protector of South Africa already made some reference to that, and I would say a little bit also along that line. But significantly, I think it is important that this discussion is of value not just to the institution, but to individual offices and to functionaries, to individual functionaries. Once I've done that, I want us to then try to get a grip of what the ombudsman ethics and integrity concerns are all about, how clear these are, and whether these actually call for the adoption of a code. But to do that, I think it's also useful to get a good understanding of what codes are all about, because I think we can raise a whole lot of expectations about what codes can do and what they cannot do. At the end, I'm hoping that we would be able to use this discussion to find not just practical solutions for a regional body like AOMA, but indeed for individual offices. So why do I think the discussion is necessary? And it's clear to make the point. Discussion we're having is about a code that is applicable to the ombudsman and their functionaries. It is not a code that will be applicable to those that the institution supervises. It's important to draw that distinction, because indeed, if the ombudsman did try to do the latter, it's clearly quite an unrealistic thing to do. And again, it's a discussion we can have in another context, but I'm quite happy to throw light on that. So it's important we're focusing essentially on what will apply to ombudsmen and to their functionaries. And the reason for that, for me, is not because we have a situation where ombudsmen have become associated with serious ethical failings. Most of the time when you go into the literature on ethics, in spite of everything, we do not have any serious concerns about ombudsmen being, but there have been cases, and there also are concerns about how we can. It's important not to feel that we're in a situation here. So I'd say these are part of the continuous effort to develop the institution. And it's very much so because we tend not to discuss ethics and integrity in ombudsmanship. We kind of just take it for granted that because we're ombudsmen, we're supposed to be people of integrity. We know what to do. We don't misbehave. We don't do bad things. And obviously, you know, we expect that
We are,
each
we are losing
one
you,
of
Professor
us
Ayani.
would not be in where we are complimenting. Ombudsman institutions are ultimately human beings create them and human beings run them, susceptible.
We've lost him.
Sorry, I think I seem to have lost.
Yeah, we lost you, Advocate. Professor?
Yes, Prof. I think it's due to network. Maybe if you can just share your screen and only your audio and cut off your video, that will help.
I'm back.
No, it's Professor, perhaps if you switched off the video, we might have a bit more,
Sorry.
a better link with the sound.
Yeah.
Honorable Nicole, let's move on with Advocate Brock, then we'll come back to Prof. Ayani.
Well, yes, we will proceed with Advocate Arlene Brock. Advocate Brock will be talking to us about the promoting ethics and accountability in government and ombudsman institutions. Professor Brock, Advocate Brock is a 2021 Senior Fellow, a 2019 Fellow of the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard University. She is developing an animated video vignette series for middle school age that presents counter-narratives to the negative stereotypes of Black peoples that have persisted over the past 4 centuries. Previous professional work includes launching the Ombudsman Institution in Bermuda as the island's first national ombudsman, a constitutional office that investigates complaints about the delivery of public services. She has also been director of the African Ombudsman Research Center in South Africa, research on capacitating 44 national ombudsmen throughout the continent, mediator with Conflict Management Incorporated, insolvency lawyer, and labor lecturer. Advocate Brock has served as chair of the Police Complaints Authority and Permanent Arbitration Tribunal in Bermuda. She holds honorary life membership in the International Ombudsman Institute as a former board member, and chair of the training committee and the vice president of the Caribbean Latin American region and the Caribbean Ombudsman's Association. Advocate Brock, you're welcome to do your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Public Protector of South Africa, Professor Vice Chancellor MacArthur, yourself, Honorable Ombudsman for Seychelles, and Victor Ayani and colleagues all. Thank you all for being here. I am so sorry that we lost Professor Ayani. He normally sets the stage beautifully for these kinds of discussions, and I normally then have an opportunity to follow on and comment on some of his comments. But we will be happy to see him a little later on. So what I'm going to do actually is just quickly run through the ways in which ombudsmen do hold governments to account. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, and then make a few observations about how we promote ethics and accountability in our own offices. So thank you for having me, and I'd be happy to entertain questions at the end. So the first thing to think about, of course, is what is ethics? And I'm not going to go through many definitions. I think we all can recognize that ethics are generally the moral principles that govern or guide people's behavior. And in the public sector, we talk about good governance, both in terms of service delivery, the use of public resources, and we also think that not only individuals in the civil service and in governments, but in the institutions and systemic mechanisms must also be ethical in order to encourage the public trust. But what we do know about good governance and ethics in the public sector is that the benefit is to the public, not to individuals. And we'll come back to that in a moment. The core principles that thus far tend to guide ombudsman practice are principles that include but go beyond the four corners of the law. Ethics is not just about what's legal, but what's right. And so in looking at trying to understand what do we mean by what's right, the core principles generally tend to be integrity, transparency, accountability, and fairness. And I'll come back to those when we look at our offices. What I would like to note is Nelson Mandela has always been a guide for me. Frankie, we can go to the next slide. I find that he still has some of the best statements about the role and value of the ombudsman and how we deliver our work in ethical ways. So I start with this quote from him, which he stated when he was speaking at the IOI's conference that was held in Durban in 2000. The rule of law consists in the set of conventions and arrangements that ensure that it's not left to the whims of individual rulers to decide on what is good for the populace. The administrative conduct of government and authorities are subject to the scrutiny of independent organs. This is an essential element of good governance. And so let's look at some of the organs that he spoke about who actually help our societies and our governments to ensure that there is ethical behavior in the public sector. Well, of course, the courts. Judicial review of administrative actions is long been the way that many people have tried to bring ethics and good behavior to the public sector through judicial review. But as we know, courts are slow, costly, not accessible to normal people, the average person. And going back to the point that ethics is not just about illegality, not even every complaint that one can bring is about something that's illegal. It's about something that was wrong in some way. So not everything can be brought to the courts. For example, delay is usually not against the law, but it may be maladministered, and it may even be unethical, depending on the reasons for those delays. Equally, inefficiency and any number of other ways that we can think about harms to the public that are not judiciable by courts. Some of the other organs are well established: auditors general, electoral commissions. I think South Africa's constitution is far ahead of many others by establishing the Chapter 8 institutions, the public protector, human rights, the gender equality commissions, etc. These are specialized. These are usually limited to governmental behaviors. So some of them are. Human rights commissions, of course, are not. And often these are periodic in the sense that the affairs of the finances of the country, for example, or of institutions are reviewed annually. But what we have with the Ombudsman is, and human rights commissions, are daily free public access. And in some ways, they are not just investigators, but mediators of disputes regarding service delivery. So I think that ombudsmen, as we all know, serve this critical function and therefore must serve the function ethically. And we go back again to the great Nelson Mandela for another quote on, sorry, not Nelson Mandela at this moment. I want to just mention that there's been some research, and I think I've referred to this in previous presentations, but some research about how we ought to think about the role of these kinds of organs that Nelson Mandela spoke about. And Professor Richard Kirkham at the University of Sheffield writes what I think is a good synopsis. He says, constitutional lawyers have always talked of three distinct and fundamental branches of the Constitution: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. We should add a fourth branch, the integrity or accountability branch. And that really, this is a theoretical development that actually recognizes how constitutions have already evolved. Many ombudsman institutions, I mentioned already, Chapter 8 institutions of South Africa's constitution, these are already parts of the Constitution. So they recognize that there's a special category of oversight, people to review and guide ethical behaviors in the public sector, and that we are not the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary. We are a different branch of government. And so if we go to how ombudsmen typically hold governments accountable, this is not telling you any of you anything new, but I think I should squiz through this in any event. Our work primarily is investigations, where we review harms, we make sure that there's due process, and therefore we gain the confidence of the people we're reviewing with good process, and also due diligence, making sure that we've tried to get as much information as possible. There's an interesting legal case out of Ontario in Canada that talks about the fact that human rights institutions are not expected to uncover every single stone and every minute point about something they are investigating, but they have to make that effort to be diligent and to get as much as possible. We also pay attention to the law. We don't say that because there are many things that cannot go to courts, we're not going to bother with the law. Of course, we pay attention to the law and to administrative law principles, proportionality, non-discrimination, legitimate expectations, and so on. But we also take into account other things. So in our recommendations, we will often talk about what's right and what's wrong. What are the moral principles behind the ways that the general public has been treated or mistreated? We uphold good governance standards and often clarify and explain and draw them out in relationship to the particular situation that we are investigating, but also generally speaking, we can help to teach the public service by being clear about the good governance standards. Best practices are a key part of what I used to do to show people that you want to be within the arena of doing things the way that other people have tried and true and understood are good ways of doing things. And we make these recommendations in our special reports, our annual reports, systemic investigations. In Bermuda, we usually gave the recipient authority, government department, the reports, and it's only when they had unreasonable responses did we go into the naming and shaming route by a special shorter report saying, you know, we've set this out, we think this is reasonable, and for some unknown reason, the government has refused to respond in a way that is of assistance to the project, to the public. And of course, training by the Ombudsman, not only in the annual reports, but in any number of public awareness campaigns, talking in the media, talk shows, etc. I believe there's some ombudsmen who also have television programs, regular television programs, at least one in Europe. And I found it was also very useful to annually have a meeting of the public service unions to answer their questions and to, in fact, help again to train the public service unions and the public servants about what the standards are that we expect. As a consequence of that, we go back now to the great Mandela and look at the way that we would want governments to respond to us. And in fact, in my first year as Ombudsman in Bermuda, I actually put this quote at the end of almost every single report that I produced, and sometimes would say, slightly in a jocular fashion, you know, if an ombudsman is good enough for Mandela, then it ought to be good enough for anybody else in this world. He said, it was never to me reason for irritation, but rather a source of comfort when these bodies, the Public Protector, Constitutional Court, Electoral Commission, and so on, were asked to adjudicate on actions of my government and office and judged against it. One of the first judgments of our Constitutional Court found that I, as president, administratively acted in a manner they would not condone. And this is the key statement, a statement of service to the public. From that judgment, my government and I drew reassurance that the ordinary citizens of our country would be protected against abuse, no matter from which quarters it would emanate. For me, that continues to be the best statement of how government ought to respond. Some of you, I understand, did ask specifically about corruption. And I frankly would commend to AORC that this ought to be its own session. I personally am not the expert in corruption. I think Africa has one of the highest serving people in this regard. Martha Shizuma, who was the former ombudsman in Malawi, she's now the Director General of the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Malawi. She's done exceptional work, and I think it would be an incredible webinar to have her as a panelist on this topic. I just want to note also that the IOI just this month actually issued a best practice paper on the hybrid corruption ombudsman. So an ombudsman that explicitly has a corruption remit. But of course, all ombudsmen, whether or not it's explicit, must be alert to whether or not there's potential for corruption, as there often is. Some of you have indicated that this is corrupt behavior is actually viewed as an entitlement in many countries. And so we have to be alert to corruption issues. In the Bermuda Ombudsman Act, if I came across anything like that, I had to then refer it to the more appropriate authority, police, etc. But I'm not going to address corruption anymore, except to suggest that this be the subject of a further webinar. So we go to the question that the Public Protector at the beginning of this session, actually, we can go to the next slide, Frankie. The Public Protector asked, who guards the gardens? And I'm sure all of you in ombudsman offices have heard this question at some point in time. And the typical answer has been, oh, well, we have annual reports of our operations in which we have anonymized case summaries, and we talk about what we did and who we spoke with, et cetera. And we also give special reports, especially of systemic or sensitive matters that are in the public interest. And then, of course, we are prescribed by our annual audits. These are independent audits, usually by the government auditors, and they make sure that we are handling the public funds well. So as I think about this question of this webinar, I think in addition to the typical response of how we as ombudsmen are accountable, is that we might look also at a few other matters. And these are some extemporaneous thoughts. They are not at all academic. I know that for all his protestations, Dr. Ayani is one of the top academics in this field, and I'm sure we will hear more from him in this regard. But I'm going to just look quickly at what I call internal good governance standards for the Ombudsman's office and external good governance guidance, which I would look through very quickly, or just mention, actually. So if we look at internal governance standards and we look at the structural piece, these are just some of the kinds of things that we think about when we think about how do we ensure that ombudsman offices are operate in ethical ways. And we know even from the appointment process, we want to make sure that the appointments of the person who leads the office of the ombudsman is not an arbitrary one or one based on how close that person is to the appointing bodies, but really who might be the parliament or the governor or so forth, but really that there has been an open, competitive process to actually find the person we want to lead that office. Often there are advisory committees. But one of the things that I would want to caution is that sometimes advisory committees might include someone representing the appointing body, might include someone from public service union, might include someone who ostensibly represents the public. But often they often have someone who has a human resources understanding or expertise, but they often don't have people who are experts in ombudsmanship. And I think it's really important that advisory bodies do get the benefit of either prior ombudsman or ombudsman from other jurisdictions to help them think about the particular nature of what would be required in the leader of an ombudsman office. Because sometimes public servants, civil servants who are on these kinds of advisory bodies tend to look at who do we recommend to be the ombudsman from their own perch, from their own frame of reference, which is usually a strict administrative law reference where you don't go out of the four corners of your legislation and so forth. And we know that the ombudsman does go beyond the four corners of the law. The ombudsman does look at what is morally right and so forth. And so we need to have an understanding just in the appointment of the ombudsman. Do we have someone of courage, of understanding, and so forth? We want to be careful that the process is not politicized. I think South Africa, with respect to Public Protector, South Africa is a very fascinating example of the appointment process because the effort is to be as transparent as possible. And so I was very excited to arrive in South Africa and to look at the televised process of politicians, the Special Parliamentary Committee that interviewed candidates and so forth. But yet at the same time, I cautioned that there was a possibility of political brinkmanship in that process. And that maybe it is necessary, it would be necessary to have a more closed process that is not playing to the politicians' own interests, as we see in the United States. That's all that happens in these congressional committees. We just saw that in the horrendous process of, if any of you followed it, of selecting this wonderful, one of the best, most experienced candidates for the Supreme Court in the US. And it was just so politicized. And so sometimes the television turns the wrong impulses on. And so maybe in the South African context, they may want to consider just having that once you've gotten the final select few, 2 or 3 people who would be considered. I think the transparency is fantastic. It's important. It's particularly important in a country with South Africa's history. The impulse to do that is great, but there is a slight downside. Then we know structurally also, we want to consider the terms of the ombudsman. Traditionally, the terms of the ombudsman have been for life. And that was important when the ombudsman first came on the scene. It's a relatively still new institution in most countries. And it was important that if you're going to have someone who is going to review governments, that you want to make sure that they do not suffer from the ire of the people who are being reviewed. And therefore, you want to have life security so that an ombudsman doesn't have to consider that kind of thing. And so that was important. However, as we know, good governance also requires a little shakeup. Good governance also requires that from time to time we have new leadership. Good governance requires that we don't have leaders who get very comfortable with, or too comfortable or too cozy with certain departments and ministers and permanent secretaries and so forth. That good governance actually does require a turning over. And so in the UK, Ombudsman Anne Abraham of a few years ago was in her 11th year of a life term. But after reviewing this matter, she actually changed the UK's public service and health ombudsman from life term to, I believe it's a 7-year term. And that's part of what good governance is concerned with. But at the same time, you also don't want renewability, because quite often your ombudsmen are humans too, and quite often an ombudsman may be concerned about being renewed for an office if it's a short 3 or 5 year term, as you see in Latin America a lot, and that might color in some way the work that the ombudsman does or the decisions they make about how far to pursue a matter or a complaint. And so it's best to have a single term. Therefore, it has to be a single term of enough time to allow the ombudsman to put their imprint on the office, to develop a philosophy and an approach of working. So usually it's a term nowadays of 7 to 10 years. One of the things that the Venice Principles, which I'll mention a little later, but the Venice Principles developed by the IOI mentioned specifically, which is that the ombudsman's term must be longer than the term of the people who are appointing them. And usually that means the election cycle. Until the Venice Principles, generally speaking, that was a good idea. But I am happy to see that it's now becoming something that people think ought to be an actual condition of ombudsman terms. So when we think about terms, when we think about structurally the length of an ombudsman's period, we recognize that that also pertains to the moral or ethical process of the operation of the office. We also want to make sure, ombudsmen need to make sure that they uphold office standards. And so that there needs to be training of the staff and of the ombudsman. When I first became the ombudsman for Bermuda, it was the first time this institution was in the country, in the Constitution. And one of the things I said in an early radio interview was, as I learn, Bermuda will learn. And so I will try to come back frequently and tell you what I'm learning. And then I also made a statement to the fact that I was in contact with ombudsmen throughout the world. I would send emails out. Have you come across this issue? How did you handle it? And why? You know, why may be good for you. It may not be the right reason for me, but I want to understand all of that. And I got a call from a high-level civil servant who said, "Oh my goodness, you should never have said you don't know it all," which I thought was really quite remarkable, because we don't know it all, and you especially don't know it all if you're the first ombudsman of an institution that's never been in the country. And I thought it was important to note that I could give myself permission to make mistakes. I could make mistakes, and then I would have to admit those mistakes. But there seems to be a civil service fallacy that you have to project, if you're the leader of something, that you're the know-it-all. And I think that's a fallacy, and it harms the standards of the office, because then we're not so credible to people if we can't admit or recognize we have to do some extra research on this or that. Staffing of the ombudsman, of course, requires diversity of the office. And I found that over time, it made more sense to actually have a human resources expert to come in and do a first call and so forth. Again, to the extent that we can pass our processes through the sieve of professionalism, that is a good thing. I know that in some offices, unfortunately, you have to go through the government process. And I believe the Venice Principles also talks about how important it is to actually independently hire your own staff. So those are some of the issues structurally that we might want to consider. If we go now to the next slide, these again are things that you know all about, because this is the work of the Ombudsman's Office, the investigation process. We go back to those core principles that I mentioned at the beginning: due process, due diligence, transparency. If we are recommending that government offices that we review be transparent, and obviously we have to be transparent ourselves. If we are recommending that they do use best practices, obviously we have to find out what are best practices ourselves, and then be clear and concise and clear and, about the way that we engage in our recommendations. We should look at them as educative opportunities. We are accountable with our reports to the public, as we said before, and maybe, I don't know if Dr. Ayani is actually going to be arguing that we also ought to be accountable by way of a code of office. But one thing we have to do is recognize that we are an alternative justice system. The ombudsman is called quasi-judicial, and that means that we have to have the basic principles of fairness, equity, reasonableness at the top of our minds. We don't have a system of precedents used in prior decisions, but we do have to make sure that we are consistent in our approach and in our reasons for things. Fair process, we know that if we have biases, we can disclose them. Sometimes disclosure is enough. And one of the things that we probably don't talk about enough is to consider our own position. And I'm going to come to that with a slightly more provocative comment, because in these kinds of sessions, we should always say something slightly provocative. And I'm coming to that on the next slide. Obviously, there's one thing that we know: we should not have any political affiliations. In the Bermuda's Constitution, for example, it specifically states that you cannot have been a senator or member of parliament in the preceding 3 years. But there's good argument that you ought to really be as neutral and unpolitical an appointee as possible. Obviously, if there are conflicts of interest, we need to recuse maybe our own selves as the head of the office and give matters to our deputies, or we disclose so that everybody's aware of the potential conflicts. And we have to balance what I call joint problem-solving partnerships with the departments and with media versus coziness. So what we want when we are working with a department to try and resolve a complaint, we want to have a joint problem-solving approach. We're not there just to bash them and to tell them they're wrong, but we want to show what would be the right way of doing things. At the same time, we want to be careful that we don't get caught by genuflection and so forth. And we similarly with the media, we want the media to expose the work of our office in a positive way. At the same time, we don't want the media to try and use the ombudsman as an instrument of their own agenda. So we have to be careful about that. I'm just going to go to the bottom of this slide and talk about proximity. For those of you who know Brian Stevenson, who developed the lynching museum in Alabama, is just an incredible human being. He talks a lot about proximity, that if you really want to understand a problem, if you want to be part of a solution, if you want to do good work for the public, then you have to be proximate to the people who are having these problems. And I think accessibility is important. We have to be alert to people who are reluctant to come forward for various reasons. We may have refugees, for example. We may have all manner of categories of complainants who might be reluctant to come forward in the public. And so we have to find ways of being accessible to them. When we make our personal choices, there's a balance, again, a balance between being one of the people, but also of making sure that we uphold certain kinds of standards for ombudsman activities. I use the word travel here. This is particularly useful to small countries, may not be useful to those of you in larger jurisdictions. But one of the things in Bermuda that the public was very concerned about was the way that politicians sort of used their travel allowances, and they were always sort of living high off the hog and didn't seem to be accountable for that. So from Bermuda to anywhere on the East Coast is at least a 2-hour trip, 1.5 to 2 hour airplane ride. And you have the right, if you're on a very long travel, more than 4 or 6 hours, you have the right to travel by business class. But one of the things I always did was on that first tranche, that first trip from Bermuda to New York or wherever I was going to be transitioning to, I would always travel by coach class. And it was fascinating because sometimes I would get on and walk to my seat, number 23 row, and people would say, "Oh, Ombudsman Brock, you're sitting with us." Now, for a small country, that was extremely important because it sent the message around the country that I was one of the people. And to the extent that ombudsmen in larger countries cannot do something like that, one of the things you really want to do is listen to your staff. Most of us have staff who are in ordinary positions, who are not considered at the top of the world, who are not elites. And so we want to always have our ear to the ground, and our staff can help us do that. And that comes to the piece that I'm saying might be slightly provocative, and that is in our in our conduct as ombudsman, we have to be really alert to our elite status. On the one hand, most of us have come out of a colonial tradition where as citizens of the country, achieving education, et cetera, is critically important, a source of pride for everyone, and something that we've earned. We didn't get these degrees and these positions just handed to us. And so it is important that an ombudsman be held in high esteem. That's sort of endemic to our position. But at the same time, we should recognize that that also is a limiting factor. And if we behave like the political elites, then we might not be as credible. So it's just something to pay attention to. I'm going to conclude now with my last slide, because I think I had expected that Dr. Ayani would have actually covered many of these points. I'm a grateful public protector. I did not include the OR Tambo principles here and should have, because that was an important work done in Africa. And I don't think that, for example, the folks developing the Venice principles for the ombudsman institutions actually consulted the OR Tambo, and it's important for us as a global community to know that we can learn from each other. The learning is not just north to south. as those of you who know me will know that I'm very concerned about. And so I apologize that I don't have the AOMA principles here. But what I wanted to do was just point out that until there is a code of conduct, if that's something that the ombudsman world is moving toward, we do have a number of ways in which we have guidance about how we ought to behave as an ombudsman officers. If we develop a code of conduct, it'll be something I imagine that is self-regulatory and similar to the legal profession and the medical professions, which are not perfect, but at least they're something better than nothing because they uphold the standards for everybody. But we do have the IOI develop the Venice Principles. We do have, by analogy, the Paris Principles for national human rights institutions, and many of our offices are explicitly also human rights institutions. Many of our offices are also national preventative mechanisms, and so the Paris Principles are critical to be alert to. I note that the IOI also had a best practice paper called Developing and Reforming Ombudsman Institutions, in which, again, there are thoughts and guidance about how the Ombudsman Office can be accountable, transparent, and have integrity and ethics. That was June 2017. There are also a couple of older explications of the issues of ethics that I think have lived well over the years. The UK Public Service and Health Ombudsman produced the Principles of Good Complaint Handling. Now, that was produced as a guide and as training for departments, for government and civil servants, but it's also equally useful for ombudsmen. And then a very old document, but again, one that sets out the principles, the ethical principles we ought to be concerned about. I think I still find it a good document. It's called Essential Characteristics of a Classical Ombudsman. It comes out of the US. Dean Agatara and Justina produced that document. It is not as useful for so-called hybrid institutions, but I think it does set out some basic principles. My understanding, I believe, is that the IOI is thinking of moving towards a peer review process where fellow ombudsmen will come in with an objective view to validate existing processes, maybe to, again, use best practices as measurements, and also recommend improvements in Ombudsman Office. We can all improve. And there was an IOI statement about that in May 2020. And then one of the things we shouldn't forget are the UN General Assembly resolutions. There are many, and I've noted that one of the most recent. So there are already existing guidance for us. If we put it all into one code, that will be great after deliberation. But I commend ombudsmen for thinking more clearly about their own offices, because so much has been left to the individual person of the ombudsman, and it is good to be guided by a general standard. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone too far over time.
Thank you very much, Advocate Brock. We are running behind schedule now, and the question and answers will have to go online. So questions and answers will be, if the questions can be sent to us, we will share them with the relevant parties, and the answers will be posted on the website shortly. I do apologize also to Professor Ayani, and would like to invite him to continue from where he left off. Professor, thank you. Professor, the floor is yours. Unmute your microphone, please.
Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, we can.
I sincerely apologize. I think today is not a good day for my use of Wi-Fi. But let me see if I can go back to my presentation and see if I just try and quickly put back share my screen again. If I miss this, what I will just do is simply just
Professor,
do
I
it
understand
back.
that you're using two appliances. That might be, we're having an echo. If you could switch
Oh,
off the
okay.
sound of one of them, please. That might help.
Yeah, I think that probably. Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you.
Let me try and speak without using the. I would just not have a screen on. I would simply not use the screen. Can you hear me?
Okay, Prof. You want to mute the microphone on your laptop and just use your
I'm
phone.
going to try and switch it. Okay. How is it now?
We can hear you clearly.
Okay, all right. I think I'm going to do without sharing my screen. It might make it easier. And again, as I said, it's a very, very unusual situation we're having today with the use of our Wi-Fi. I was trying to explain what I think is the focus. I felt was the focus of this discussion. And some of that also has been mentioned by Aline. You know, the real question that we have here is, do we need a code for the Ombudsman? And as I was explaining, I think it's very important that we understand that the desire for a code is not because we feel ombudsmen have serious integrity problems. And it's also not because we think we want to create codes for others. And drawing that distinction, in my view, is extremely important. But to make the discussion on code useful, I think what Eileen already has talked about is extremely helpful. We have to put all of this in the context of our discussion of ethics and values, because that really is the underpinning of all of this. How does that work? Values, as Eileen also mentioned, are basically those enduring beliefs that we have about the way we should do things. You know, should we be honest people? Should we have integrity? The ethics built on that by setting the principles and the rules that we are supposed to follow. As you might say, they are a subset of our class of values. And values as well as ethics are part of our wider moral beliefs. The three together determine the motive that motivate us, and in turn then determine the way we behave. That applies to all human beings, and ombudsman institutions are no different, in the sense that what they do is conditioned by the kind of values, the kind of ethics that they have. They motivate what they want to do. It influences their decisions. That determines their behavior, and of course, the outcome that we see. As ombudsmen and as human beings, we almost take all of this for granted. And the impression has always been that we as ombudsmen would almost know all of these things very naturally. But what we know is that we tend to pick up a whole lot of that, either through the way we train, through the stuff that we read, and of course, through the way in which we associate with others. So you would argue that for any institution to work effectively, its value system needs to be fairly clear-cut and very solid. And when you begin to have problems with the way people behave in an institution, one of the things you are interested in is the kind of ideas that motivate them. And this is why the whole discussions around corruption would always tend to pay quite some attention to our value system. I think that is useful for us to understand where codes come in. The fact of the matter is that because ombudsmen, as I said earlier on, are human creations, they are predisposed to making mistakes like other human beings. But over the years, we've learned to find ways to manage and to deal with that. But a number of our realities have compounded that. One is the fact that as the institution has become increasingly professionalized, the expectations around it has increased, which in itself is a direct relationship, is a direct correlation of how the ombudsman institution has spread around the world. The fact that we have several different ombudsman types have also compounded it, in the sense that when we talk about ombudsman, we're actually talking of not less than 50 different type of institutional types. 50,000 institutional types. And what that means is that each one of these might tend to be motivated by different things. And although we do seem to believe that there are certain recurring features of all ombudsman institutions, we increasingly see that those different types do have their own different variations. And this is useful for this discussion, because when we talk about codes, it's very important to understand what ombudsman are we talking about. We seem to assume that we all are the same, but the truth is that is not quite the case anymore. So to a large extent, the AOMA group is largely a group of governmental bodies, but you do not have ombudsman institutions in the continent that are not necessarily part of government. There are a lot of corporate, there are sector ombudsmen, and all of these do have a right to our discussions in this area. One other important point that is worth mentioning here is the fact that the way the ombudsman institution is constructed is built around the concept of what we call the personal touch. And the personal touch of the ombudsman is one of its distinctive features. What that has also meant is that a lot of legislations almost tends to put a lot of authority around the individual who heads that institution. That means that individual can potentially be very vulnerable in the way in which they use that institution, those powers. And increasingly, we see quite a lot of that also in some of the ombudsman offices around the world. So in a sense, that defines the context in which we have to put this discussion. And the context, if I might quickly summarize, one is about recognizing the role of values and ethics and motives in the way in which we behave. And two, recognizing those factors that have shaped our institutions and the way the ombudsman institution has become quite diversified, and recognizing that it's not just one single homogeneous institution anymore. And then thirdly is the distinctive feature of the institution, particularly in regards to its personal touch. And of course, I should also add also the concept of flexibility. The fact that the institution almost naturally has to be very flexible also means that it can get into very tricky ground in the way in which it takes decisions. So what I did in the presentation, unfortunately, I cannot show it, was to try to demonstrate how some of these values play out in the way in which we behave in the workplace, as well as the way in which the institutions behave. Let me give you some of the quick examples. These are questions that you and I would almost take for granted every day, but they underpin to a large extent some of our values. A question like, for instance, how many of us take stationery or items of the office from the workplace and take home to use? How many people use simple things like using the office resources for your own personal use? How have you asked a colleague to cover for you, when you know that you were supposed to be in the workplace? Have you had cause to exaggerate your achievement? Have you had cause to blame others for your mistakes instead of taking responsibility? Have you been in situations in which you have tempered advice that you give because you do not want to rock the boat? Have you had course, to take free lunches from clients and customers. They look quite mundane, but they actually, those questions illustrate the kind of potential ethics issue that each one of us will face in the workplace. More serious one will be questions like, does my association as an ombudsman potentially compromise the independence of the office? Do I have a situation in which I have put the trust of the public at risk in the way in which I behave as an ombudsman? So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the fact that asking questions that we often take for granted help us to begin to illustrate the kind of ethical issues that we have to have. As Eileen also said earlier on, we do have more serious ones, and which many of us would tend to talk about all the time. How confidential are we in the way in which we operate? How independent are we? Are we objective as an institution? Are we being fair? Do we provide and foster the right remedies? All of these different questions raise ethical issues. Earlier on in the opening presentation, the public protector also makes reference to questions about how we hire people for our office. Do we hire people in the office because they are our friends or they are family members? Do we have situations in which we have compromised the way in which people were judged in the office for different positions? Those are potential ethical questions that each one of us as ombudsmen and indeed as people who work in organizations have to face all the time. The question that the presentation had asked me to do, therefore, is this. Because we have to deal with these questions, do we need to put all of that into a code? My answer to that is no. And the reason is partly what Eileen said. The ombudsman since the 1960s have done a lot of work in terms of articulating the underpinning principles and value considerations that it should involve the institutions. And she did provide a list of that. I provided a fairly long list in my presentation, and they would include the following. One, there are provisions in the various ombudsman legislations, or in the case of corporate institutions, for instance, the policy statements that directly refer to those kind of considerations. Published resolution, the UN General Assembly, which Eileen mentioned, the Venice Principle, the Paris Principle, the OR Tambo Principle, and of course, the various regional principles that have been produced in Europe, in Africa, as well as in the Pacific over the years. One of the most highlight of all of this is the International Ombudsman Association Standard of Practice and Code of Ethics. Anyone who is interested in what ethics is should probably make a reference to look at that. The International Ombudsman Standard of Practice and Code of Ethics. I think to a large extent, they have been the one that have taken this discussion, the farthest. In addition to that, we also have a number of regional and sector associations in their various membership schemes defining various expectations. And I think a good example is the UK Ombudsman Association, and what they have done in this regard. The individual offices also have produced complaint handling manuals, operational principles and guidelines. Again, some of that examples was given by Eileen. And many of them do define some of this underpinning principle. We also know that quite a number of offices have developed client charters and so-called client operational standards. Again, many of these define those principles, and they are used by offices. We have office human resource manual and staff manuals and handbooks, also defining various expectations, particularly in terms, for instance, about how you deal with staff, how you deal with your subordinate, and many offices have developed some of this. The National Public Administration Standard in individual country almost inevitably also affect the work of the ombudsman. And in almost all of our jurisdictions, particularly in Africa, ombudsmen are expected to align themselves with the National Public Administration framework. So for instance, if the public administration framework clearly states that you cannot discriminate, then you don't expect the ombudsman to do the same either. Two other interesting examples are the general legislation that you will find in many countries. For instance, where you have a country may have specific legislations on human rights, for instance, or they may have specific legislations on environmental expectations, or they may have specific expectations in terms of how people are dealt with in the workplace and people who have to deal with government offices. Ombudsmen are expected to comply with those. And two other examples I wanted to make are office bylaws, as well as Walter Gerhon's. Walter Gerhon's annotated model statute is probably the oldest of these principles. This was produced in 1968, and what's really set the tone for what others subsequently have to work on, including what Dean as well as some of the other publications that have come out recently. The point I'm trying to make from all of this is that the Ombudsman institution already had a rich source of ideas about what its principles are, what the underlying ideas are. So the question is, why the fuss about code? My view is that I think we all probably think there's some magic wand about what codes can do, and that may be one reason why we are talking about it. It may also be because we think that to a large extent, people are not sufficiently conscious of all the different sources. And I've seen that in some of the recent work I've done in Africa. I go to offices and I was shocked, for instance, where officials in the office have never heard of the Venice principle. So the extent to which individual offices, share and popularize some of these different sources, I think will probably be a problem. But because those problems exist, in my view, does not necessarily lead us to trying to have a code. But let me quickly talk. I then took some time to quickly talk about what codes are. I think the best example, for those many of us, the 10 Commandments will be one. The 10 Commandments that was given to Moses when he went on the mountain would be probably, regarded as one of the earliest of that form. The Greek Hippocratic Oath, written in the 4th century, is another. But in more recent times, we've had the International City Managers Association, which is actually regarded as a fourth public administration code in the world. I think that was about 1924. Codes come in different forms. They come as code of conduct, code of ethics, code of practice, professional code, oath of allegiance, charters, general orders. They come in various forms. So when we talk about code, we're actually not talking about one homogeneous bit. They come in very different things, in very different shape. And because they come in different shape, it's easy to confuse them. And I think, again, it's quite possible that many of us do feel that when you talk about code, you're talking about one homogeneous bit. The other important part about them is that they would tend to have different levels of generalization. Some are fairly specific, some are very detailed, and some just simply lay out broad guidelines. But what they all try to do is that they provide a systematic effort to define what is acceptable conduct. They interpret the standard that we are supposed to use in the organizations. And then more importantly, they try to clarify the kind of values and the kind of ideas that should bind us in the way in which we do our work. They are not meant to be laws, and they are supposed to be different from laws, but to a large extent, they can help us as organizations to tailor our behavior to fit particular situations. I have no doubt in my mind that because code have such attractive features, that may explain why we think they are worth us discussing in the context of the role of the ombudsman as well. Because they seem to find a fit and ready way of capturing fundamental principles that underpin our roles. But as I've said, ombudsmen have had different shapes of this. They don't always call them codes, but all these different things that we talked about do essentially the same thing. So I would argue that hardly any one of us would not be familiar with one or more of all the different sources that I mentioned in the list. But the truth about it is that the ombudsman as we have it today has all these different principles spread in different sources. And because they are spread around in different sources, they can get a bit overwhelming and they can get a bit confusing for us. But the other important part of it is that because they appear to be spread around, it sometimes looks as if they are not coherent and that are not in a systematic form. And I think that was what the Venice Principle was trying to do. But the problem is, and that to my mind is a fourth important problem, is that if you take the Venice Principle, for instance, it focused a lot on what others should do, not what the ombudsman should be doing for itself. So to that extent, some would also argue that it weakens the ability of such documentations to help to guide the conduct of those who work in those institutions. It may well be that because we have all of these different things spread around like that, and because we haven't paid sufficient attention, there are probably serious ethical issues going on in ombudsman offices around the world. I think that needs to be investigated more. I have in my own work found some fairly serious cases, extremely serious cases among ombudsmen. But again, these are few and far between, and one cannot in any way describe them as systematic. But what one can say is that there is clearly a need for ombudsmen to discuss more what their ethics and principles are, and particularly as they apply to their various institutions. But having said that, I do not think it necessarily leads us to the question I was asked to do. What I then did in my presentation, I listed about 7 different reasons why code will not work for the ombudsman. One is the fact that if we really have to talk about code, we'll be thinking about something that is comprehensive, that takes everything together. And in the light of all that I've said, trying to take everything together in one document will be an overwhelming task. It's probably just not worth it because of the variations that different institutions do have. The other important part of it is that the ombudsman, as I've said, now has many faces to it. So you will need to capture each one of these different faces. And that would confuse those who are operating as well, because what you will have is a situation in which people sometimes don't know which one they are using for which part of which situation. The ombudsman is an institution, it's a brand, it's a service, it's a profession. All of this will need to be captured. And doing that, in my view, would be fairly overwhelming. The other important problem is the fact that ombudsmen also operate at different levels. So are we going to be talking about code in a global sense? Do we talk about it in the context of institutional type? In other words, in the context of, for instance, governmental or public sector ombudsmen, or we talk in terms of the sector or the corporate, or are we going to be talking about regional or national or individual offices? Or do we even talk about the ombudsman profession if something like that is actually emerging? So I think, again, that raises a whole level of confusion, which to my mind is going to distract a lot of our attention. 3 other important points are worth making. I've mentioned the fact that the ombudsman is now a heterogeneous institution. It operates in public, private, and third sector fields. And again, you're not likely to have a code that applies to each one of them. What the International Ombudsman Association has done is the fact that because it deals largely with the non-governmental type, it's been able to drop some broad principles. And those broad principles are actually no different from what you will find, for instance, in Venice, or even in what Walter Gerhard did in 1968. We also have a situation in which we have different orientations now about the institution, and that orientation also, in my view, brings up a whole lot of problems. So the conclusion of all of this is that I do not think that thinking about a comprehensive code is what our energy. What we should be talking about, because there are a number of other things we need to do. The energy we need to draw up codes, I think we need to divert, we better use in trying to achieve other things. And there are quite a number of things that I then list in the presentation that I think would be of much use. So I talked about what I think needs to be done differently, particularly in terms of strengthening what we do. One is, and building up on the discussion that Eileen also started, we need to have more discussion around how the Ombudsman can be held, can hold itself accountable, and how it can guide its own staff in terms of, what staff needs to do. There need to be more serious and systematic discussion in individual offices about ethics, about values, and how they apply to the institution. I think that we are not doing enough of that, and probably that is something that is worth doing. And the list of the examples that I found in the presentation, which I think will be shared later on, would certainly be a good way to start. And I think offices can use those list of examples for raising awareness in their offices, and also they can use for strengthening the way in which they support their staff. Other areas that I think are worth talking about, I do also support the idea that some more peer review is a useful thing. And particularly in the context of Africa, I think it's worth looking at. But I think the IOI framework will need to be tightened, which, I expressed those views when we talked about it some time ago here in London. But certainly peer review is a useful and necessary thing that we need to be talking about. Thirdly, I think the regional and sector groups might want to do something. So it's quite possible, for instance, that IOMA could make an attempt, building on Oliver Tambo, to try to distill those things that deal specifically with what ombudsmen should do for themselves. Oliver Tambo is not too different from Venice in that it focuses heavily on what others will do. I think there might be some usefulness in creating a one-page which we can hang on our wall that reminds us of those essential principles that we as ombudsman operatives need to always bear in mind. And I think that can easily be distilled out of O.R. Tambo, drawing a little bit more from Venice as well as the others in terms of developing that. And then also, I think ombudsmen have not traditionally had the habit of holding one another seriously accountable publicly. In fact, I know of hardly any example where ombudsmen have stood up in a meeting and said to one of them who was misbehaving, "You shouldn't be doing that." I think that habit needs to improve, in the sense that, and perhaps maybe peer review can do it if we don't doctor it too much. But certainly I think there is a sense in which it probably ombudsmen need to take more seriously how much and they can hold one another accountable. So if we see one of our members doing things that we think is not right, we should be able to speak up and be able to say to them, "Look, man, you're not supposed to behave like this." I think that would also help us to strengthen the way in which we operate as a group. The final point I was raising that I think is worth looking at is that in all of this, I think offices need to do a lot more work for themselves. So we might talk about principle in a global sense. We might talk about principle in a regional sense. We might talk about principles at sector level. Individual offices must have clearly defined schemes on what are their core principles and core values. And I think it might be useful if we develop IOA and IOMA might want to do a template which offices can use. What I also know, and again, I think this hasn't been seriously investigated, offices have drawn up client charters and client standards, but very few of them actually hold themselves accountable to those things. And I think our ability to monitor and hold one another accountable will also be one of the other things that I think we need to do. So to summarize, I hope my discussion, my presentation have been useful. I do agree that there's a need for us to, in terms of how we strengthen our institution, to have more discussion about what we do, about our values. There's a good reason for us to continue to have more discussion along this line, but codes are no good if you cannot monitor, you cannot police, and you cannot implement them. They are no better than display documents. And an ombudsman displaying documents around the place, which they have no use, which they are not able to implement, is actually damaging for the institution. And this is why I strongly disagree with the concept of a comprehensive code. But I think at national level, you might be able to do something. And I would really strongly recommend individual offices at national level to develop something for their own offices. At that level, you can't do effective monitoring, because the ability to monitor and police for a code is important for its usefulness. But in terms of what happened at regional, I think some broader principles could be articulated so that we make our staff more aware of this. And I guess that some work can also be done in that area, building on the things that we have. And the final point that I want to raise is the fact that there are many sources, and these different sources, if we can pull them all together, we're trying to do that in an exercise that we're doing here, it will be useful in terms of functionaries, particularly some of the younger people who are joining our institutions, to know where they can readily go when they need information about our office. I hope my discussion has been useful. I sincerely apologize for the way the IT has not been helpful to me today, and I commend my discussion to everyone. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for your intervention and very, very thoughtful compilation of all the factors that we need to take into account. We're doing very badly for time. The two speakers were so interesting. I felt that the last thing I wanted to do was interrupt, because I felt there was an awful lot that you were presenting and that needed to be said. I will be very brief in wrapping up on this. I don't think that we can take any questions, except perhaps to just point out that what comes out of this discussion this morning is that by and large, we have a lot of equipment to keep our house in order as Ombudsman. We don't necessarily need a common code to all of us, because in fact, a common code may be more distractive than constructive for us. And that if we simply focused on the elements that we have, the obligations that we have with respect to our own activity, our own function, and our own appointment in our various positions, we already have the makings of an internal code that should keep us in check and operating under the best possible circumstances. I think that a lot of the questions that have been posed concern leadership, and I don't know that either of the speakers have focused a lot on the question of leadership as such. We have assumed that we are good leaders, but perhaps that is an area where there can be a bit more reflection, and perhaps for the future, even a separate part of a discussion where we can look at leadership qualities and what is it that will make us capable of using all the information that is available to us to be able to create those internal codes that will make us work very effectively as ombudsman. That I don't know if either of Professor Ayani or Advocate Brock would like to answer that very briefly. Obviously, we have to be quite brief. But if you care to just mention or at least make a proposal with regard to the question of leadership, which is a common thread through many of the questions that were said to us earlier. Thank you.
Sorry, could I come in there? Just a quick one. I think, hello, the point about leadership for me is very simple. I didn't see the discussion. Leadership and code are not the same thing. And there is no need to confuse the two. Whether or not you are a leader, the question about your ethics applies. And I think that's essentially why, in my view, I didn't discuss this so much. Ombudsmen are proposed to provide leadership in a sector. And what we are talking about is for them to play that role, though that needs to be underpinned by values and by certain principles and consideration. And that's essentially what we're talking about. But in strengthening the ombudsman leadership, I think that's a whole separate discussion and what needs to be done and how the ombudsman can play that role effectively. I really think it's not the discussion for today. And that's why I didn't think it was necessary for us to do it. But having said that, ombudsmen are also not doing too badly in this regard. There is room for a lot of improvement, but I think sometimes we also need to commend ourselves for the effort that we are making in our different jurisdictions. Thank you.
Brock would like to add a word to that.
So I agree with what Professor Ayani has said. The questions that I saw regarding leadership were really about how do ombudsmen influence leaders in government and parliament and so forth. And I think that is a different discussion and a bigger one. I don't think ombudsmen are actually going to be able to do a lot of work in that regard. That's something that the whole country has to deal with. In terms of the ombudsman's own leadership, in many cases, they have been vetted before being appointed by bodies that at least have some openness about the role of the ombudsman, and therefore many of them come into the position as leaders and just have to continue to be alert, as I mentioned earlier, to our own positionality when we're dealing with our offices and our staff.
Thank you, Advocate Brock. If I may hand over to our chair, Madam Chair, for the wrap up and farewell comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Nicole, Professor Ayani, Advocate Brock. Your presentations are so encouraging, eye-opening. And indeed, Professor Ayani, as you are saying that we shouldn't be academic about whatever we do, but then let's be practical. And I think all of us, or most of our institutions, as far as staff members of our organizations are concerned, we do have various policies which governs the behavior, the conduct, the code of conduct of our various staff. But then I think it's also very critical for us, well, as public protector, we are now also considering to have a policy dealing with the ethical conduct within the institution for staff. But then coming back to the issue of us as ombudsmen and public protectors and mediators, I will propose, Prof, that because this is the second time we are deliberating on this matter, and I think as AOMA, we will have to meet and deliberate and check whether we cannot have, coming from the OR Tambo guidelines, yes, Advocate Brock, I acknowledge that actually even the Venice Principle have a lot of commonality between the two. And I think from us as the African Mediators Association members, we can also draft a guideline. And Professor Ayani and Advocate Brock, in South Africa, as you know, that the public protector investigate members of the executive under the Executive Members Ethics Act. And that act has a code of conduct for members of the executive. And I think it can be used as a guideline for us. I mean, Professor Ayani, you are mentioning that how an ombudsman is conducting themselves. For instance, this code deals with a number of issues relating to whether the executive can undertake any other paid work, conduct, not to be inconsistent with their office. You mentioned that, Professor Ayani, how you behave, how you maybe employ your families and stuff like that. Avoid conflict of interest between their official responsibility and private interests, and then not to enrich themselves, but also goes further and says how you exercise your duties, your powers diligently, honestly, and that you always fulfill your obligations as imposed to you by the Constitution and the law, act in good faith and in the best interest of good governance, and also in respect, acting in all respect in the manner that is consistent with your office. So I think we can draft something along those lines. It's not obligatory. It's a guideline for everyone. I mean, with us, this generation, for the generations to come, also to have something which will guide them to make sure that we look within. As you are saying that possibly the Venice Principle, the OR Tambo, it's sometimes also just checking what is expected from the state about us, the independence issue, well-resourced, and the tenure of office. But I think as well, we should then, we can do that as Africa and lead in that within ourselves as a guideline to have something like that. So thank you so much to everyone. And as the facilitator, Honorable Tirant, has indicated, questions will be answered, those which have been asked and they have not been answered. You'll access them through the website of AORC, and you'll also, they will send to you the presentations. And Prof, we will appreciate your presentation because you couldn't screen that, but Advocate Prof, we have yours, and if you can share, it's a lesson for us and we will continuously refer to it. And thanks, Professor MacArthur, for always welcoming us, for always availing us, for always being the support to our AORC team. AORC team, you have outdone yourself. We apologize to the Portuguese speakers. We couldn't provide interpretation. We will improve next time. Thank you so much. All the best to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to see you, Victor.
Thank you. Goodbye.